Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the third part of the anatomy series on the lab. Sitting with you, as always, you have Alex Trotter, Brandon Weirg, and I'm Lou Follenkamp. Last week's episode, we talked a lot about the knee and, training of the quadriceps, the hamstrings, and just those few muscles that kind of cross down into the knee joint from the hip. Today, we're going to talk about the muscles that primarily act on the hip, and then kind of hash out
Shakira.
Oh, is that your way of saying hips don't lie, Brandon?
There we go.
Oh my gosh. Wow. You got a deer in headlights look from Trotter. And I was like, is that really Brandon singing right now? That is Brandon singing.
Like
Man, okay. I did. That caught me off guard a lot. Like a lot.
God,
Just
I
come
thought
to me.
fallen.
That was good. Okay, I'll let you have that one. You get one. Shit. Lost the train of thought.
Blue.
Oh, hush. All right. So, anyways, the hip joint. All right. So the hip, you could break it down into flexion, extension, right? Adduction or bringing the leg in, abduction, and then also internal and external rotation, right? So you have muscles along the backside of the hip, the lateral aspect of the hip, the medial aspect, and then the anterior. So the posterior aspect is going to be more of your glute complex. And then we'll also get into some of the deep rotators, but we won't talk a whole lot about those. And then if you go to the lateral aspect, I'll kind of break that down a little bit more because we actually already talked about one of them. And then going along to the medial aspect of the hip, you have the adductor group. Along the anterior aspect, you have the hip flexors. Okay. So kind of starting off, we'll go to the backside of the hip here and we'll go to the glute complex. So the very first muscle we'll talk about here is the gluteus maximus. The second one you have is the gluteus medius. And then last but not least, you have the gluteus minimus, right? Those are all along the backside and lateral aspect of the hip. They primarily are going to work with hip extension, hip external rotation. And then really that's primarily what the glute max will do. The glute medius and minimus are going to account more for that hip external rotation. And then the minimus actually has a little bit of, and I guess the anterior fibers of the glute medius will help with internal rotation. So you can go into that, and then over the top of the anterior fibers of the glute medius and then glute minimus, you have the TFL. We didn't really talk about this a whole lot last time, but the TFL has got more of a hip internal rotation moment as opposed to an external, but it also will help with hip abduction. The glute medius and minimus will also help with hip abduction. Just to kind of name the big ones right off the bat. And then going into some of these deep muscles of the hip on the backside. How many times have people heard about the piriformis, right? Everyone hears about the piriformis syndrome, all those wonderful things. Again, it's an external rotator, although depending on who you read, it could potentially change its function depending on hip flexion. It has a very weak moment, I'd say, for external rotation just because of where it attaches. But then also abduction and extension of the hip. If you go into the deep, I mean, you have your gemellus muscles, you have the obturator muscles there, but again, we won't dive into that. And then last but not least, the quadratus femoris, which also helps with hip external rotation and adduction of the hip in particular. So that's the posterior hip muscles, which we also already just talked about the lateral hip, so we can skip right over that. But for those, just for rehashing, glute medius, glute minimus, TFL. Going into the anterior of the hip, just to kind of reiterate some of those muscles that work on hip flexion in particular, the rectus femoris is also a hip flexor and a knee extensor. And we talked about the sartorius in last week's episode, but the primary hip flexor muscles are actually the psoas major, the psoas minor, and then also the iliacus. Now, how many times have people complained about like anterior hip pain with squatting? Sometimes you might be getting into that point of depth where you might be impinging upon those tendons. I mean, obviously, depending upon the type of pain that they describe. But the psoas is actually a very unique muscle in regards to where it starts. It's actually all the way up in your lumbar spine off the lateral sides of the body. And it comes all the way down into the anterior aspect of your hip. It's a very big hip flexor muscle. Can sometimes lead to a lot of dysfunction, both in the lumbar region and also with like knee drive for sprinters. That's why sometimes you want to watch how much anterior pelvic tilt sometimes the runners can have. Just can lead to a lot of dysfunction with regards to that and jumping. The iliacus, I've had more issue with my sprinters as of late, who just, it's a big restrictor on hip extension. But that can also, I mean, they work together to form the iliopsoas tendon, right? So if one's under functioning and one trying to do too much, sometimes you got to kind of pick and choose which is the irritated one. But either way, you want to train hip flexion to develop strength for that. But I love needling these two, the psoas and the iliacus, both. They're wonderful to get. Sorry, I know I'm kind of going through everything, and then we'll kind of talk application. But to kind of break down even more into the inside of the thigh, so you have a lot of what are called adductors, right? The adductor group along the medial aspect of the thigh. They'll bring that hip inward or that thigh inward. So these can sometimes also mimic groin pain or what people would almost consider like hip flexor pain. But they're going to be a little bit more high and inside, depending on what you irritate. Reiterating what we talked about last time, that gracilis is an adductor, but it goes all the way down into the knee. That's why we talked about it last week. But there are so many adductor muscles, right? So you have the pectineus, right, which is a really high and inside muscle. Going a little deeper, you have the adductor brevis. There is the adductor longus. And then last but not least, and this is the one I love talking about the most, this is the adductor magnus. This is usually also implicated with like the knee inward movement at the bottom of a squat. But we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But all of those wonderful muscles work to bring your hip inward. I forgot one. The adductor minimus. Adductor minimus. So all of those adductor muscles work to bring the thigh inward, right? How often do you see specific programming that incorporates the adductors, besides like Copenhagen planks every once in a while?
We do them.
Well, well, I'm glad you do them, but like with everywhere else where you guys have been, like how often do you see in programming that they're specifically adding in adductor training?
It's pretty rare.
I'm gonna say I love this again.
We did some of my internship,
soccer
but that's
basketball
about
people. Some of your internship?
Yeah.
So this is one thing that I think needs to be addressed more often, is because adductors play a big role in hip stability more than what people will like. How many times do you hear people screaming out glute medius to the rooftops, and that's going to develop hip stability, and that's going to be your mainstay for creating and reducing ACL tears. Well, I mean, there's a lot of play on hamstring strengthening, but you also have to have strong adductors. Pivoting, cutting, all those require adductor strengthening. And I think people just undervalue it in a lot of different training programs. It needs to be more of a mainstay or even just an upkeep than what people give it credit for. But let's see here. Yeah, here it is. So like in particular, the adductor magnus, it is a huge muscle and actually has one of the most, one of the longest insertion points along the medial aspect of your femur. It does have some attachment point into the knee, but the reason I wanted to save to talk about this is because the deeper you get into hip flexion, the more of a pull or more activation you're actually going to get out of this. So like sometimes when you see people who maybe don't know how to coordinate their glutes when they're trying to get out of the bottom of the hole, you will see a very large adductor drive coming up out of the hole, right? That knee whip inward as they drive up, and then they get like that power TP, and then they're able to bring the knees back out as they come back up. Is that inherently bad? I mean, if you have strong muscles to kind of help coordinate and control that, I think sometimes knee valgus gets a bad reputation. Granted, is it 100% efficient? Probably not. But I mean, if you're loading on a 1 rep max, 2, 3 rep max, there's gonna be some like compensation. And depending on where your trainer wants to kind of take you there or not, that's up to them. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I think you got to look at the angle of the ankle joint too on valgus. These people that it's like, okay, your knees are caving in, and they instantly think it's a valgus knee,
Yeah.
but it's not quite the case. It's more than just knees going in.
Mm-hmm.
Could be an internal rotation at the hip, and that's why you have that angle. So, which you see a lot of like pro basketball players, like Kevin Durant's really known for that. Michael Jordan, if you like break down his shot, he had like a what some people would call the valgus knee, but really it's just his hip was internally rotated when he'd go up for his shot, which would give that angle, or a lot of people say the triangle.
Yeah.
So,
reference on one of our athletes is Big Al's boyfriend, Malcolm. He is so crazy explosive, but his hips internally rotate to create that torque. It's like he's jumping off a trampoline, like when he jumps and he cuts and stuff like that. But, I mean, he's a great example of that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different things in regards to knee valgus where people will demonize it. I think if you can have a good system of strengthening everything around the hip and the knee joint, let alone the feet, it could also become your superpower. It just depends. I mean, sometimes when it gets neglected and you just keep falling into it, you never really develop the stability for it. It's not inherently a great thing. It's like playing with fire. I mean, look at RG3, right? A lot of his jumps, he was extremely internally rotated, and clearly his outcome in his professional career as a football player didn't pan out well with the amount of injuries he continued to sustain. So, I mean, while there are also people who are great examples of using this and being successful and, have been championship winners, there's also people who can't really make it pan out using those types of mechanics.
So there's a big argue that he might not be able to. If they would have changed his mechanics, he probably wouldn't have been the athlete that he was.
Yeah,
exactly.
So regardless, his professional career wouldn't have panned out.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he would have had a lot less knee surgeries, but he also wouldn't have been in the position that he would have been in, arguably. But
yeah. I mean, I guess another example of this would be like looking at Olympic weightlifters. There's a lot of Olympic weightlifters when like they make the catch in the bottom of the hole, and as soon as they drive up out of that hole, their knees will kind of do that bob and weave inward, and that's just how they've developed strength and stability. So I mean, again, I wouldn't want to demonize it, and I think if they're really strong in that way and they can strengthen everything around it, it can be effective. I think it just goes like that. That's why you individualize the program based off what the athlete needs and, where they're weak at, right? But with the hip, I think that some things that get lost in translation, everyone loves squats and deadlifts. I think one thing that people need to start developing is more of like that rotational control and capacity. Because, I mean, if you're constantly doing deadlifts, RDLs, you will develop a strong hip, low back, and extensors. Posterior chain is fantastic, but how have you guys gone about developing like hip rotation, explosion, or power production, as well as just like stopping and changing direction?
We do a lot of like landmine rotations, things like that, stuff that requires like the hip hop. We'll do banded rotations, and a lot of anti rotations, kind of fight that too. And then just like a lot of things we just do in speed and agility class. I mean, everything you do is you rotate.
Yep.
So.
Okay. So what would you guys say out of all the muscles on the hip, which gets the least amount of love by trainers or by coaches in general?
Probably anything inside.
Adductors and hip flexors.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
I would say I'd agree with that.
We do try to keep it semi-balanced, but it depends on the sport and the athlete too, like Brandon mentioned.
True.
A lot of it to do with, like if you're in a sport that involves like a lot of cutting, like a lot of lateral cutting, You know, like you're planning off that leg, but you're also pushing off with the inside leg too.
True.
So like you're getting a lot of stimulus from that.
So you make all these athletes switch from a trap bar deadlift or conventional to a sumo, and it's like, holy shit. Yeah. So yeah, you need those.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. Have you guys ever had anybody who's had like just absolutely the hardest time developing strength in the hip flexors or the adductors?
Yeah, Coach Trotter.
Yeah. I'd agree with you on that one. That is for sure.
And I'll be honest.
Yeah. Ever since we got the monkey feet, though, a lot of people are just, it's been a lot easier to target those muscles.
Yeah.
I agree. I love that thing. That thing is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
Hit it in standing position, laying down positions. You can stretch it out a little bit more. Just having them maintain certain angles when they're doing their lift to try to keep that pressure more in the hip flexor and less in the quad and things like that.
So let's see here. For a sprinter, where would you say the person needs to be the strongest in their hip flexors? Whether they're in full hip extension or moving from like mid stance going into the knee drive?
I mean, they're both very valuable or very huge roles. So I mean, I'm not going to sit there and neglect one or the other. I can see, you can sit there and break down their mechanics and see where their leak is, and you can teeter their workout to that individual. But I wouldn't say right out of the gate, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to target this one versus that one. Extensions where you get your power from, though. So I mean, it's easier to train, but usually there's going to be some type of a lot more hip flexor injuries, I guess, if it's weak and you're trying to produce maximal power with it. So you definitely can't ignore it.
Yeah, I think that I agree. Over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, I've seen more injuries when the leg is like they're moving through hip extension, and it's just the tolerance to eccentric loading of the hip flexor, like as it has to lengthen. And I mean, there's been 2 or 3 sprinters who have like really started to like take off with like the addition of like full range hip flexion strengthening, like taking them all the way back into that fully extended hip and then having them drive it all the way up into the knee high position.
Well, there's certain angles you have to reach for that to activate, isn't there?
Yeah. So how do I put it? So like the iliacus, and like once you get to you only have about 20 degrees of hip extension, right? So if you cannot tolerate and control that hip extension beyond that, like going back to that point, and you're already wanting to compensate like right out of the gate, like when you get to neutral, as the leg's going back underneath you, and you want to anterior pelvic tilt, your ability to load that hip flexor is dog shit, right? So like think about like the triple extension, and like this is how we can kind of like coordinate the 3 joints together, right? So you have like ankle plantar flexion, pointing of the foot, you have knee extension, and you have hip extension, right? So this is why we want to talk about like what muscles cross 2 joints. So like the hamstrings and then also the rectus femoris. So like sometimes what you'll see is that break in the knee when people move through that. But the big thing that I look for is what is the femur's capacity to move back into that hip extended position. If you can't do that beforehand, and granted, your knee's probably going to break as well. When I say break, your knee's going to bend. I'm going to look up at the psoas and the iliacus first, see what their tolerance is to just lengthening. And then I'll also have them try to go through like just a strengthening program for that to see if that allows for more of that hip extension as they move through that triple extension. If I get a little bit of improvement, great. If I get a ton, then probably it's not the rectus femoris. But then I'll also start working on that triple extension and the knee stability. So like making the hamstrings really strong in that extended hip position, but then also teaching them how to lengthen, like almost like a Thomas test. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but like when you go and bring them into that full hip extension and you see what is the quality of their knee bend, or is the leg just floating there? I have a sprinter right now that you guys are working with that we had to really work on his hip flexor flexibility because he couldn't even get the leg to neutral, knee bent or straight. It would just float. And then even when we flexed him a little bit more, the knee still wouldn't bend. I was like, oh boy. So he just had a lot of dialed up tone through the hip flexors and through the rectus. So we worked on a lot of that flexibility, but then also just strengthening eccentrics. So like I love RDLs for hamstring flexibility. I absolutely do. I mean, you wanna do a little magic trick. Get this: 5 repetitions, right? I want everyone to try this sometime. 5 repetitions, a 3-second eccentric, and do a 3-second pause, and then come right back up and repeat that 5 times. Now, before you do that, reach down and try to touch your toes and see if you can get them, because you might not be able to get there, right? But then after doing those 5 repetitions, try it again and watch how much farther you can get down towards your toes. You know what? You didn't do any like flexibility training. All you did was just teach your nervous system how to control tension through the hamstring.
A little PNF stretching.
Exactly. So like there's man, I see all these flexibility and like mobility programs, but in reality, you just change up how you're doing your strength and conditioning, and you just modify like tempo, or you add the eccentrics in there, and you can create a whole bunch of strength in a lot of different places just moving into new ranges. But anything you guys want to...
different phases of sprinting also determine different angles of hip and knee joints. So like if you're accelerating, you're coming, like say a track athlete coming right out of the blocks, you're going to need about 105-degree knee lift relative to your body just to be able to produce power. Because if you got a 40 to 45-degree lean and you only got a 90-degree knee lift, you're not going to have enough room between your foot and the ground to throw a punch. So you have to have that little extra 15 to 20-degree knee lift to be able to throw that punch, to where at top end speed, your hamstring will contract a lot more, so you can get that nice tight cycle. But then you only need to get about that 90-degree front side mechanics. So then be able to produce power in those ranges and extend out of those ranges is where a lot of those times you'll see the injuries occur, because they don't train maybe in those ranges, and all of a sudden you ask the body to produce the power it's not ready to do, and then something happens.
Like the perfect recipe for disaster.
Yep.
So what, if you're a sprinter, what would you say would be like the 2 or 3 muscles that like people absolutely need to train? Like if you're maybe not necessarily like if they're weak, but like what would be like a mainstay for a sprinter to really stay up on?
Hamstrings, hip flexors, and groin.
Adductors. Perfect. Yeah, I'd agree.
Between calves and groin, depends, I guess. So
yeah.
Or shins, depending what event you do.
We could get more specific if you want.
It comes down to the event, I guess.
True. Maybe we can make that an episode. We pick different events, and you could break down like what the sprinters need.
It'd be tough. It'd be based on the athlete too.
Yeah, that is true. That's why we do our needs assessment, right? But anything else you guys want to add on the hip?
Nope.
All right. Well, we hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion on the hip anatomy. Next week we will talk about core training. All right. Core training, the core musculature, so maybe not necessarily just your abs, but we'll break that down in next week's episode. So have a good weekend, everybody.